Okay, welcome. Let's try this again. So unfortunately, Zoom did not record the meeting, so I'm going to record this again and put it up on the website. If Zoom deteriorates, well, this is not relevant anymore because we just did the Zoom. Okay, so these are in the slides. Today, what we're going to talk about is Gary Becker's theory on quantity versus quality of children. It's an influential theory, but it's tough to model, and I think we are probably going to get some confusion. Regrettably, we didn't record the questions, the very good questions and the answers that I tried to provide for this live. We'll try to cover them here and hopefully they can become clearer as we discuss on Piazza. The learning objectives are that substitution effects on caffeine emerge out of Becker's model and they push families strongly toward quality during development rather than quantity of children. We'll talk about China's one-child policy, beginnings and end, and in particular, the salient question here is whether the one-child policy reduced fertility or not, and the answer might surprise you. We'll look at baby boys versus baby girls and what we can see in the 1990 Chinese census in Lab 9, which will be due later in April. So if you can, look on the funny side of life. COVID-19 is a big bother to all of us, a huge cost to some. If you're traveling home, safe travels to you. Somewhere in between being a big bother and a huge cost is the complete collapse of the division of labor and childcare, which my spouse and I and many, many other parents around the world and in this country are facing right now. I'm more tired than I thought I could ever be running a household and caring for a 3.5-year-old. And our 14-month-old is still in a family daycare that hasn't closed yet, so we are waiting for that other shoe to drop. I hope it does not. It puts family economics into a sharp focus if my eyes could still focus at this point, which I'm having a hard time with. Trust me, however, it's a pleasure to be doing this, even for the second time again. I really enjoy this material. I hope you do too. I think this session will have some more challenging material than the previous one, but I hope I can bring to you the vision of family economics that's fun and interesting, especially about the historical demography. Family economics are very real to me. Someday they might be, or today they might be very real to you as well. My partner and I both work. We now have 2 children. We'd probably chosen to have 3 if not for constraints. And so the constraints we face are biology and physical strength. You gotta grab the kids and throw them all around when you're changing their diapers and picking them up and walking them home and all this. And we're both no longer spring chickens here. And that was really brought home to me yesterday when we had a little temper tantrum back on a walk and I had to carry her all the way home. It was about half a mile. She's fantastic and it's okay. It's part of being a parent. Financial costs are quite salient as well, and that's the more obvious thing. Annual costs of schooling alone are about $36,000 for our household, or about what we pay in mortgage for a house that's big enough for them to live in. We still feel lucky, but these are large and can be sobering, and certainly for me, when I step back and think about it, especially given what's happening with the labor market right now, it's a cause for some alarm. There are many ways forward for you, so don't get discouraged about this. And of course, it's probably far from what you're thinking about these days. That was true for me 20 years ago, and it's doubly true, I think, for you, given everything that's happening. There's delay, there's co-residence with parents and grandparents, there's childlessness, and of course, there's striking it rich or moving to a lower cost or higher government area. So, for example, if many other parts of the world provide more support for working parents, the United States doesn't really cut it in that regard. There are policies, but they're not what they are elsewhere. Let me say a few words about Gary Becker, whom I had the privilege of meeting once before he died in 2014. He was one of the most influential microeconomists ever, and he was a mentor to Michael Grossman, who is the CUNY Distinguished Professor of Economics, contributed to theory and empirical economics alike, which is no small feat to do both. And famously for the work that we're going to talk about, he was laughed out of seminars for thinking about child education and the causes of it, because the model R-squareds were very small. There was a lot of variation in child education that was not well explained by the variables he was looking at. But the t-stats on the key coefficients, meaning the statistical significance of the variables he was exploring, were quite large. So the statistical significance of things was high, even if overall the model wasn't explaining a lot of the variation, and that was a bit of a novel concept at the time, when econometrics was a little bit younger. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1992 for having extended the domain of microeconomic analysis to a wide range of human behavior and interaction, including non-market behavior. He visited UC Berkeley in spring 2013, spoke about education, and I got to meet him, and it was a great pleasure. So the hyperlink there is to a student newspaper article, the Daily Cal, about the things he discussed that day. I got to say hello to him afterward and told him about being a mentee of Ronald Lee. That was a great time. So next, the quantity versus the quality of children. So with the value of time model, we saw that there were these countervailing prognostications, these countervailing predictions about what would be produced as a result of development. So an increase in the husband's wage would lead to increased fertility through a pure income effect. Increases in the wife's wage had dueling income and substitution effects. For women who weren't in the labor market, industrialization would only bring a pure substitution effect toward more work and fewer children. So that's a tough thing to get one's head around, but if you could think about that during some part of development, that would give you the right theoretical result. But the thing is that from there on, increasing women's wages, which we empirically saw, wouldn't necessarily, in a theoretical sense, change family size, even though in the data we see this strong reduction of family size. So we've seen the family size decreases strongly during the demographic transition, which typically coincides with industrialization. How can we reconcile these views? Is the value of time modeling correct? No, we haven't talked about child quality, and doing so will get us to a place in which the substitution effect is amplified sufficiently to get the story straight, basically. There are stronger substitution effects. They are on caffeine in the Becker model. So this is the Becker reading in Chapter 5, which is part of his Nobel Prize-winning canon of work. Child quality hasn't been ignored. It's in there. In the way we wrote it down, the value of time model has it in here as this multiplicative part of the shadow price of children that's in there. And this will show up in a slightly different form in several slides. So we could model an increase in child quality by increasing that parameter in this model. And that would produce the same result then as an increase in child consumption price. But the contribution that Becker brings is this insight: the quality is a good, and what you get when you see that and incorporate it into the model is a substitution effect on caffeine. Quality here means investments of time and money. Education is the most obvious measurable dimension of quality, but you could be facetious about it and say it was fancy clothes or something like that, and certainly those cost more money. So why do we want to have children? Common to all living organisms is biological fitness. The thing is that you might increase that just by having more offspring. And there are animals that do that. Sharks, of course, the crazy thing about sharks is they produce a lot, then they eat a bunch, and then the rest survive. Humans are different. We have very large brains, and we have a long period of dependency because of these large brains. But perhaps the large brains bring us higher quality of offspring, certainly relative to sharks, even though I guess if you took sides in a shark versus human fight, I guess the problem is you have to know whether it was on land or in water or something, but that's not maybe all that directly obvious. The quality of human children relative to sharks is rather clear if humans are able to produce ideas that result in better shark catching equipment and things like that, right? That sort of thing is the way you get out of that. Quality in offspring is desirable when social structures reward it in terms of reproductive fitness through the marriage market or indirectly through socioeconomic status, for example. Other reasons for child quality might be things like this: companionship. Many children provide more companionship, but maybe fewer children with more education provide quality companionship. Elder care might be more easily purchased by children with higher earnings. It might be figured out better by children who have been problem solving their whole lives because they have a higher amount of human capital or something like that. But more children provide more kids over whom to spread the burden. The other thing to say here is that sometimes the sex of the child matters for burdens of elder care, and that varies a lot across different societies. Finally, you could think about bragging rights, some benefit to parental well-being of keeping up with the Joneses, having children who are more successful or something like that. So why do we care about this? As social scientists, education or human capital investment appears to be strongly linked to growth, and we think that education probably causes growth rather than the reverse. And it answers this question, why do people in some countries have lots of income? It's probably because they have lots of education, while people elsewhere have less. Here's a scatter plot of the story, with the United States at the far northeast of the diagram here, and the Democratic Republic of Congo at the far southwest, at very low levels of GDP per capita in 2000, very low levels of average schooling. And you see a cloud, but there is a very tight upwardly sloping relationship here, relatively speaking. More education seems to bring more GDP per capita. Here's a look at the total fertility rate along the horizontal axis compared to years of schooling on average, where there's a strong downward sloping relationship here. The United States is clustered up here with a bunch of other countries. Here's Israel, for example. Here's Jordan. CHE is Switzerland. DEU, I believe, is Germany. And down here, I think Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, perhaps, not CMB, I'm not sure. Zaire maybe is, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I think probably was coded like that. Here's Uganda down here at the other end. So very high levels of total fertility here, also very low levels of schooling. Here's a different look drawn from a survey of older Americans who were born between 1931 and 1941. We're looking at a scatter plot of the average years of education for an individual against the number of living siblings that the person reports. Now, how you get 20 siblings, well, there's probably only one person out here who claims to have that many siblings, and it probably also measures things like step-siblings too, which would be dependent on the marital patterns of the parents. Still, a pretty stark result here that this is downward sloping, that at least empirically speaking, there's this pretty strong relationship between the number of children and the average years of education, which is not to say that this is always true within families. It's just it seems to be true on average, that the larger the family, the fewer the number of years of education that get completed on average. So the quantity quality model looks like an extension of the value of time model, which was the model from last class on Tuesday. The two models just examine different decisions. We're going to assume that parental consumption is given in the child quantity quality model. And by contrast, in the value of time model, what we were doing is assuming the quality was given and fixed, and parental consumption was variable. So we're going to fix parental consumption and instead let quality be variable. The parents have already decided how much to work and consume and have a fixed amount of money to devote to children. That's our story. And the parents must choose the number of children they're going to spread that money over, recognizing that spending per child produces an average quality, which is a good just like quantity. We assume that each child receives the same quality input. Now, in the real world, of course, things like birth order affects quality inputs. Sometimes sex preference by the parents does as well. Another thing I didn't mention in class, but there's evidence too that parents might actually redistribute toward needier children. An obvious idea here is, suppose a child is born with a disability, then the parents probably invest more units in that disabled child to help that child more. And you could also imagine a child, for example, one out of several who perhaps loses a job or something like that gets helped out more than the other children who might maintain employment. So parents do a lot of things in the real world, and we're going to abstract from that and just assume that they're exactly the same. Each child it's exactly identical, and right? Is when you say it, you're like, well, okay, that's absolutely not true in reality. Okay, on average, again, looking back at like this picture in particular, I think it really cements it for me. On average, there seems to be this quite tight relationship between the average years of education and the number of living siblings. So like before, we have a budget constraint and preferences. So here, the blue line, and this came up today during the Zoom class, that the blue line is the budget constraint, and it's a hyperbola. It's because income, uppercase Y, is distributed across the number of kids times the quality units that they have times the price of the quality units. So here we've left out a bunch of these other pieces that are going to pop up later in the slides a little bit, but this is the bottom line sort of important part here. It's a hyperbola. When you're distributing quality units per person, then the problem is that when quality is a good and the number of kids is a good and they're multiplicative, you end up with this kind of thing. It implies that an increase in the price of one of these things really will get you a large substitution effect toward the other one, and that's going to be the punchline. So can there be a tangency with indifference curves when the budget constraint looks like this? Yes, as long as you have indifference curves that show enough complementarity. So if you think about these things going together, and of course it's pretty obvious here, if number of kids needs to be a complement with quality of kids. You can't have high quality without number of kids, right? These are not obvious substitutes. Complements are things like, for example, milk and coffee or tea and coffee. You need to have one and the other in some reasonable proportion. You can't just have all or all of one or all of the other. If you'd be okay with more of either one, then they're close substitutes and the indifference curves are very close to being linear, very gently sloping. Think of coffee and tea, for example. Maybe those are good substitutes. If, on the other hand, these goods are complementary enough, there'll be an interior optimum with a tangency instead of a corner solution, so it looks something like this. So here the red curve is the indifference curve, the blue curve is the budget constraint. And there'll be some optimum here at the tangency, and that'll be the choice of the number of kids and the quality of children. So Becker then says, well, the thing is, if you look across development, it appears that the income elasticity of quality appears to be higher than that of quantity, which appears to be negative. So as incomes rise, child quality increases while child quantity decreases. And this is basically an observation about what preferences must be given the patterns that we see. Child quality is a normal good during development. Child quantity appears not to be, that as incomes rise, child quantity falls while quality rises. Graphically, this is what it would look like. So income rises, we see a shift in the budget constraint out in this fashion. And the argument would be that the complementarity, if you will, the income expansion path gives you this kind of backward bending trajectory of the optimality points here. So N double star and Q double star might actually be to the northwest of the original point, provided that you've got preferences that look like this. So the challenge here is that, you can draw indifference curves any old way you like, as long as they don't, for example, overlap up here. That's good. Why do we see this kind of thing? It's because of the interaction between the hyperbolic budget constraint and these curvilinear indifference curves. When you've got a hyperbolic budget constraint, it does things like massively change the substitution effect, get it onto caffeine and increase it. So that's the punchline here. The other point to say is that we don't have returns to education. They're part of all this. When you see extremely high returns to education because, say, of technological change, then if parents care about their children's well-being in and of itself, so parents want their children to be happy, and happiness of their children will be driven by the earnings of their children, for example, that suggests that the demand for quality rises strongly with development. So this is kind of stepping back and saying, well, the empirical story seems to be one here where an income increase would actually get you toward fewer kids, N star falls to N double star, and a greater amount of child quality. Why might that be? It's this point about education being very, very well rewarded in marketplaces, which it really is, especially in the United States, but also in other countries. So when quantity demanded, also the price of quantity rises a lot, and we demand less quantity. And the takeaway then is that these trends, development, technological change, rising incomes appear to bring higher demand for child quality, lower demand for quantity because of a very strong substitution away from quantity and toward quality. So here's a formalization then from Becker and also from Tim Guinnane, and I'll post a copy of Tim Guinnane's study, which is pretty advanced, but I like it because it reveals this point. So here's a budget constraint, and the key point is that the shadow or total price of child quantity rises with quantity and also with quality. It keys off of this point that here's a multiplicative interaction. So P times Q times N. We've got a little C attached to it here because there are several different prices going on here. There could be a total price of children. Maybe this is beds of to house and take care of kids. Here's a total price times quality units times children, which would be something like sending each child to school. There then also could be some kind of cost of the quality that is shared across all of the children. You could think of that as being some kind of common classroom spending or something like that. Maybe a minivan that gets children to and from school or something that they all share. The point is that there's this interaction term here, which we had seen in a different form in an earlier slide. That's important. And so that thing then will be causing the action. So a usual price of quantity of kids, a usual price of quality, and then this multiplicative interaction term. There are, of course, other things that parents buy, and so we'll just kind of toss it up there and then promptly ignore it because it's not part of the important story. Uppercase I here is income. It's the same as uppercase Y in the previous slide. If the price of child quantity rises because the bedrooms or pregnancy become more costly, we're going to see the standard substitution effect away from quantity and toward quality. But then also, if quality rises, it pulls the shadow price of quantity, which is the sum of these two things, up even higher. So if quality rises, it pulls this additional piece, this thing, higher. And so the relative price of N then is not only just the story about bedrooms of prices or the prices of going through a pregnancy or something like that becoming larger. It's also a story about this extra spillover effect, if you like, of the quality thing. So there's this extra substitution effect, and you can visualize it here as being the sum of these two things, if you like, if that helps. Substitution becomes more strong in the Becker model away from quantity and toward quality. So the bottom line then is that you've got these amplified substitution effects in the quantity-quality model that push parents more strongly toward choosing quality, towards choosing education. So in the world, we see rather strong movement toward more education in all different regions. In developing countries in 1960, the average years of schooling was only about 2, more than doubling by 2000 up to 5.1. In advanced countries, average years went from more like 7 to more like 10, and the United States was on the high end of the group of advanced countries. But note here that even today, the average years of schooling are maybe a little north of 12, in other words, a high school diploma, but they're not enormous. And I think, an important thing to take away from your time at UC Berkeley is that you will be joining a very elite group of about, here, if it were 2000, about 25% roughly of the population who has completed a college degree or more. Today it's maybe more like a third, but it's still a minority. Not everybody has a college degree. We are among the lucky few who do. So, human capital and knowledge, critical for development. Neither land nor reproducible capital seems to be capable of sustaining long-run growth because of the diminishing returns that we run into. Human capital is markedly different. Education gets absorbed by an individual, and then educated individuals spread knowledge and ideas to each other. And you don't have to be a scientist to do that, right? You can run a business and spread ideas about how better to do things. Thank goodness for Amazon during this current downturn, which is the brainchild of somebody who may or may not have finished a college degree. Many entrepreneurs do not, but they know how to communicate with each other, which is typically correlated, let's say, with education. Knowledge may not be subject to diminishing returns because it's not a physical good and it can be easily shared. And one view is that the demographic transition and fertility decline in particular is a key enabler of human capital investment. So here I want to talk a little bit about Tim Guinane's discussion of these 6 different potential causes of historical fertility decline, where he thinks that number 4, the changes in the opportunity cost of childbearing, are the most plausible for explaining historical fertility decline, especially in places like France and especially in the United States. And this one, number 4, is what you would see in the value of time model that we looked at earlier, and also in the Becker model, either one. When there's a cost of childbearing and it rises, it causes these income and substitution effects technically, but especially when the woman is not working to begin with, you'll see a pure substitution effect away from childbearing and toward work and toward higher earnings and financial and economic well-being. These others, though, are useful, and if you find this interesting, it's a dense but I think illuminating read, and I'll post it shortly. So one point to say here is that during the course of the demographic transition, infant and child mortality usually falls first, and then fertility falls afterward, providing this period of population growth during which the transition takes hold, perhaps a reduction in per capita income to begin with, but then as that bulge of babies moves into the labor force, a big increase in GDP and ultimately of capital as well. Well, what can we say about the connection of these two things? If you have high infant mortality, plausibly maybe the reason parents are having lots of children with a high fertility rate could be because of expected mortality. So if you want to have a certain family size, you might increase the numbers of children that you have because you know that some will die. When mortality declines, parents may not immediately adjust their family sizes over time, that they will. This fits the post-World War II experiences of developing countries pretty well, but it doesn't fit US or France in the 1800s where fertility fell first. And Tim Guinane also points out that if infant mortality falls, that might actually reduce the fixed costs of having surviving children, which would trigger income and substitution effects toward having more children. So there must be something else going on. He talks about contraception technology, and to make this very clear, we're not talking about the pill. We're not talking about highly effective measures, methods of contraception in modern periods. We're talking about historical periods. And here, then the relevant thing would be the price of a year's supply of condoms here in the 3rd bullet point, for example. That was what the technology was. The other methods, of course, were what's sometimes called the rhythm method. So you look at particularly fertile periods throughout the monthly cycle. You can also use coitus interruptus. My advice to you, of course, is don't do that. use modern technology, but historical technology was expensive, and Guinane's point is that even during this period, fertility was falling, and thus it must have been because of choice and using more primitive methods that he thinks it wasn't the availability of contraceptive technology. This is controversial, especially if you think about applying it to modern development perspectives. The direct costs of childbearing were also changing here. So Guinane writes about land prices were rising, but the problem is that a lot of necessities actually saw reductions in prices. And couples, of course, could choose rural living rather than urban if you thought about land prices. Child labor laws were also something he discusses, and this could have changed the net price, if you will, of children, because children could, in principle, work and sort of offset some of the cost of having children. His point there is that it's hard to know whether child labor laws really restricted the choices of parents a ton, or if they just reflected what was socially normal by the time the laws were passed. So Guinane drills down on what we have drilled on, which is that the opportunity cost of childbearing appears to be really important. In the United States and elsewhere, some industries like textiles employed women throughout the course of industrialization and not in a U-shaped pattern. And textile work paid much better than spinning yarn at home, but some countries discriminated against married women, creating an incentive to delay marriage. So you could say that in addition to changed wages, also there was this issue about social stigma here toward women working in this case and toward delaying marriage. So sociology is also important as well as economics. Both of these then would raise the opportunity cost of childbearing. Even though there is also an income effect of a higher wage, Guinnane seems to believe the evidence supports a dominating substitution effect that strongly reduced fertility. There were changes in and increases in net returns to child quality, by which we mean education. It's easy to measure costs. Compulsory schooling laws and hookworm eradication offer some pretty clean evidence that reduced costs raised enrollment and reduced fertility as a result. It's also possible that child labor laws reduced opportunity cost of schooling, which is, of course, working, which you do if you're not in school. The gross returns are harder to measure, but there was one estimate here down at the bottom of the slide of the benefits of literacy in Victoria, Britain, rather large, 200 pounds compared to costs of 4 pounds. So Guinnane thinks that that's potentially important, but not as important as the opportunity cost of women's time. Finally, then, he talks a little bit about social insurance. One reason why you might have children is to take care of you in old age, and so this is salient, but he says the timing is not right for the United States and France, where there were early fertility declines and social insurance had not been developed yet. So you could also make an argument, too, that in a situation where you saw industrialization and migration of children away from families, they might be more likely to default on this loan, if you will, from parents to children in exchange for elder care later. And so if point number one is correct, then you might actually expect more fertility to result during industrialization. And of course, we saw the reverse of that. So like all good Journal of Economic Literature pieces, there was a clarion call for future research here. And if this is enticing to you, I encourage you to follow up on it in a senior thesis or in future studies, really understanding the effect of women's labor force opportunities on the demand for children during the fertility transition in developing countries, to understand the economics of the fertility transition, to use historical sources to increase our knowledge in this area. I think it's a very fertile ground kind of topic, pun intended. So now let's move on to China's one-child policy and say a few words, courtesy of Zhou Yi, who was a GSI back in 2012 and 2013, who's now an assistant professor at Beijing University. So prior to the one-child policy, a later, longer, fewer campaign exemplified here by this great poster of a female worker with I think it's a female worker with a welding mask, and it's just a great image, isn't it? It's kind of like Rosie the Riveter here in the United States. Later marriage, more work, suggestions to postpone marriage, to have longer birth spacing, to have fewer children. Here's a fantastic placard of 4 different images showing happy families with small numbers of children, with productive daughters. In the second panel here, this is a daughter using a microscope, for example. Here's a daughter writing at a table. Here's of course, a totally lackadaisical son just being himself with, of course, a gun. But the suggestion was to find joy and fulfillment in having a smaller family. Deng Xiaoping brought in many reforms in China. The new leadership had a strong commitment in developing the economy, bringing in market reforms. And here I believe he's talking with Jimmy Carter, trying to incorporate science, modernity, and policy making all together. And the belief that without some big abrupt change, China would not achieve good high levels of well-being if population growth were to proceed unchecked. So the beginnings then of the one-child policy were in local government regulations, formally announced then through the People's Daily in 1980, an open letter to all party members and all Youth League members, advocating each couple should have only one child. After 30 years of implementation, we may switch. Here's a snapshot of a newspaper. That must have been the one referred to on the previous slide. A period of flexibility and decentralization followed not long afterward. Practical difficulties in the earlier years, one of the state party apparatuses allowed greater flexibility in local practices, flexibility to permit maybe 10% of the population to have 2 children, like an exemption for minority groups, condition 2-child policy in rural areas, making changes gradually, not in large movements. So the restricting of the one-child policy listed among 3 basic state policies in the 8th five-year plan in March 1991. Here's a really fun graph of different Chinese provinces over time. So the horizontal axis here is time, starting from 1980 and going through 2000. And the vertical axis is an index of years of income in a fine that would be paid for having more children. And as you can see, there were differences across provinces in which one of them instituted fines. Here's a pretty big jump in Beijing. Here's another big jump in Liaoning. Here's Xinjiang. And you can see some of them are bigger jumps, some of them are smaller, and some are rather flat, as you can see there. So differences across provinces, and you would see this sort of thing as well if a policy were to be tracked across states, for example, in the United States. And then finally, the end of the one-child policy in 2014. I remember at the time, this was a pretty big development, and many of us in social science were wondering to what extent this would change life in China. One of the fascinating things that we'll see shortly here is the lack of evidence of much aggregate effect of these policies. What were the motivations? A lot of them came out of topics that we saw earlier in 175. Faster population growth would cut into capital accumulation and living standards in education. If you thought of something like the Solo model, if the saving rate were fixed, then a rise in the population growth rate would decrease capital per worker and income per worker. Here we've also seen, of course, an increase in child quantity would probably work in reverse with the quantity quality model then. It would probably increase the price of quality, for example, or keep it very high and not result in any education, or at least not modern levels of education. So those are the motivations. Then segue into discussing the motivations behind the switch to the 2-child policy. The circumstances were considerably different in 2014. The rate of population growth had fallen a ton. The labor force had declined a lot in size. The society was more aged and faced challenges that, to be honest, required more workers, not fewer workers. A lasting imbalance in the sex ratio, which I'll have more to say about in a second, and I think you will explore in lab number 9. And finally, then, in part because the earlier policy change promised a reevaluation later, and that roughly lined up with the 30-year window that was discussed. So the question you may have to ask is, what happened to fertility as a result of the one-child policy? Here's a graph of the total fertility rate over time between 1950 and 2008, with the TFR starting at about 6, a big dip here, down to about 3, and a big increase back up north of 7, down to about 6 again, before a gradual decline that was sustained into below replacement level fertility here. Replacement level was 2.1. So you might ask yourself, where is the one-child policy hiding here in the timeline? Is it at point A, when fertility was very high at around 6, right before this big precipitous decline and then an increase, a rebound? Was it at point B here before this big, long, sustained decline? Was it at point C here, where the decline had already set in, but we hadn't actually gone below replacement? Was it at point D before this other dip? Was it here at E off into the future. And the answer may surprise you. I think the natural choice probably would be here, that maybe B was the imposition of the one-child policy that maybe produced this big reduction. Well, it turns out it was actually at point C. So the TFR had already fallen quite a bit. The one-child policy does not appear to have done a lot in terms of the TFR in China, unless you think a very slow decline might have been the result. It doesn't seem all that plausible. Here's a graph showing a bunch of different, somewhat comparable countries, developing countries: Mexico, India, Thailand, South Korea, and then the other two that are as yet unnamed and will be on the next slide are urban versus rural China. And the question that we might ask then is, which is higher, rural or urban fertility? And the answer here shown on this slide is rural fertility is higher. It's remarkable that urban fertility in China was already the lowest out of all these nations as early as 1965. Now, this is comparing apples to oranges because all of these other countries, of course, have rural areas in which fertility was also higher. Even in rural China, though, so that those are the red boxes, we see this rather precipitous decline and then a significant narrowing of the gap between urban and rural areas happening. Well, the biggest drop here really was prior to the one-child policy, starting probably in 1970, falling significantly. Another example of a comparison that might be fruitful is to look at China versus Taiwan. China and Taiwan share a lot of things, not government per se, but a lot of cultural similarities persist. There are typically differences in some of the, technically differences in some of the cultures but from the different ethnic groups that are represented in the two regions. But what happened was that in 1949, the Chinese nationalists retreated to Taiwan, leaving the mainland. And you might say that in some regard, comparing Taiwan and China will tell you something about similar societies over time. The one-child policy then was here in 1980, and there at that point, of the two groups, the one that saw a reduction in fertility probably you would say was Taiwan. It was not the place where the one-child policy was implemented, which is actually the People's Republic of China. So there too, this comparison does not suggest that the one-child policy had much of an effect on the TFR. China was a bit ahead of the curve here in this way. Looking at GDP per capita along the horizontal axis, the TFR fell a lot further than one would have predicted based on these other relationships here. Now, to be sure, in each one of these countries, there was a different relationship between GDP per capita and the total fertility rate, different levels, if you like. All of them kind of show a curving relationship here. China still was probably the most ahead of the curve, if you like, in this regard, reducing its fertility much more than one would have expected it would have given its level of GDP per capita. One of the biggest implications of the one-child policy was an imbalanced sex ratio. If you think about parents' choices of sex preference just based on strategies and simple stopping rules, things like having children until you get the sex that you prefer, that's not going to change the sex ratio that you might normally see. And in all human populations, it turns out to be roughly 50-50. It's a little bit more in favor of boy babies just by a hair, but not by very much. And in China, we don't see that at all. A sex ratio that suggests a lot of changed behavior in response to the one-child policy. And this consisted of sex-selective abortion, hiding girls from enumeration, differential mortality that disadvantaged girls. A very challenging legacy, to put it mildly. Lab number 9 will be due later in April, and in Lab 9 you'll look at the 1990 Chinese census. It's known to have a lot of child underreporting. Maybe we can still see effects of the one-child policy. Happy spring break. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon.